Happy Tuesday morning. Happy election day to everybody out there. I hope everybody has a chance to go out and do their civic duty today. But we know that's not everything you want to hear about and talk about today. We know you want a little bit of a distraction. You want to think about something different, take your mind off all this for a little while. So I've got something good for you. I am here with two of the absolute best reporters in the Southeastern Conference. That would be John Talty to my right, Matt Zenitz on the bottom of our pyramid here. And we're going to talk to you about what's going on in the SEC right now here on First Down South, our second episode of this new show that we're trying out here on AL.com. Guys, it's a busy day. We're all anxious. So let's talk about some stuff that's going to make people anxious on Saturday instead of tonight. And that would be the ongoing SEC football season. Auburn and Alabama both have this weekend off, so they get a little bit of a rest. But it was an interesting weekend last week, to say the least, particularly with Auburn and LSU, which was just a stunning beatdown that I don't think a lot of us saw coming, at least not to the extent that we saw in this game. So I want to start on the Auburn side of this with you guys. What happened here, I guess? What's different, and is this something that we can expect to see more going forward? Has Auburn turned a corner, John?
It's a great question. I'm not quite at that point to say that they have, but I do think it was easily their most complete performance, and really the performance that we've been waiting on them to deliver all season. I think we've made, Matt and I have both brought it up, I think, in recent weeks that, Auburn really easily could have had their record reversed and have lost games to Ole Miss, games to Arkansas. Even Kentucky had some issues there. And so we hadn't really seen a strong performance to them to this point. And finally, we saw Bo Nix play much more comfortable, was able to hit some of those downfield passes that he struggled with, particularly that nice, I think it was 91-yarder to Anthony Schwartz. And so I saw a lot that I liked from Auburn. Their schedule sets up very nicely going forward, getting Mississippi State coming out of the bye. That looks like a pretty easy game for them based on what we've seen. And so I think they're starting to gain some momentum, but I'm not at a point where I can completely forget all the struggles that I saw in the weeks previous to say that they've completely turned the corner.
Matt, the schedule that John mentions does seem to go well for at least the next few weeks. They obviously still have Alabama, which they have to play on the road. And this weird quirk in the schedule this year where Auburn actually has another game after the Iron Bowl. And it's not the easiest opponent to have to come off the Iron Bowl against. They have to play Texas A&M in the last week of the season. Are we going to crash back down to earth here at some point for Auburn?
I don't think that's really going to happen until the Iron Bowl. So yeah, I think Auburn's in a great position to be 6-2 going into that game and have a good chance to extend what's a 2-game winning streak to a 4-game winning streak by the time that they face Alabama. So it's a team that's definitely trending in the right direction. They had not only a great performance from Bo Nix, but just a great overall performance as a team against LSU, where you got the season high 300 passing yards from Bo Nix. You had the most lopsided win in the 119-year history of the Auburn LSU series. You got in excess of 200 rushing yards, an average of close to 5 yards per carry. And then guess what? Defensively, you almost have 2 defensive touchdowns. I think it was 3 total takeaways, 4 sacks, and you hold LSU's running backs to somewhere in the range of 2.5 yards per carry. It was a great, impressive all-around performance. And then once again, the great part for Auburn is you have a favorable schedule these next few weeks with the bye and then games against Mississippi State and Tennessee leading into that game against Alabama. And then guess what? You have a chance also at some point during the course of these next few weeks to get back your defensive captain, one of your team leaders in KJ Britt, who's obviously been out for these last few weeks following thumb surgery, but is in line to be back at some point leading into, at the very least, the Iron Bowl.
So here's kind of, and look, the Iron Bowl, I think we'll do plenty of shows about that at some point as we get through the season. I am really kind of curious, and I think it's being overlooked, at least by me. It's not a game I think about a lot as we move through this season. But that Auburn Texas A&M game to me is so strange. The timing of it, the matchup itself too. I think we would be considering that a pretty big game on Auburn's schedule if it was happening, around now, or if it happened in October. But it's the week after what we know historically and in recent history, especially for Auburn. The whole program is kind of built around getting yourself up emotionally for that game. There's art in all of their buildings, in their football facilities, about that game. It is the thing you build towards the whole season. And then they have to play another team after it, who are, honestly, I don't think enough people are talking about Texas A&M. Am I way off about how important this game is?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. John already knows my thoughts on A&M.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example as to just how difficult of a slate that's going to be for Auburn at the back end. Matt and I team up, Zenitz and I team up to do SEC power rankings each week. And in our power rankings that we released earlier this morning, Alabama is number 1 and Texas A&M is number 2. So Auburn's going to have, as of right now, what we believe to be the 2 best teams in the SEC have to finish their season. So that's extremely difficult. Texas A&M has finally started to kind of hit its expectations that we had for them. I'm still not quite as much of a believer as Matt is, but they're at least the top 2-3 teams in the SEC. And again, it's just going to be very difficult. We also know that's just a weird kind of rivalry in that it seems like is it the road team that usually wins that game?
Yeah.
So there's always just something kind of weird that happens between those 2 teams when they meet up. So it's a very big challenge for Auburn to win or lose in that Iron Bowl, to have to come off of that and turn around and play Texas A&M, which, if you look at Texas A&M's schedule, shapes up very nicely for them to win out leading up to that Auburn game.
And that game is at Auburn, by the way. So let's talk about the other side of this Auburn blowout over LSU here. And I think we all came into the season thinking that this would be a step down for LSU, a pretty big one, considering everything they lost, talent and coaching wise. I absolutely admit, and our producer Patrick has not let me forget it. I absolutely did not think it would be this level of drop off. I think this is a stunning disappointment of a season so far for LSU, and they still have some really tough games left that they have not played yet on their schedule. So they're in a precarious position. Now, obviously, you're coming off what a lot of people would argue is the best season in program history. I think it would be hard to argue against that. So there's a lot of good feelings and a lot of sort of that leeway that you get after accomplishing something like that. But it's kind of hard to justify the depth of how bad LSU has been this season. They're not just losing a bunch of games against tough competition. We know that they opened the season with a loss against what looks like it is one of the worst teams in the SEC in Mississippi State. A blowout loss to Auburn, which is embarrassing, and you never want to see that happen. If you consider yourself an elite program in college football, blowout losses are pretty tough to stomach. So I guess, first of all, is there something more going on in Baton Rouge than just they haven't been able to recover from the pieces they lost? Is it as simple as that? Was this just inevitably going to be a really rough rebuilding year?
It's been rougher than I expected it to be, especially defensively. So it's always important to point out with LSU, everyone wants to talk about what they lost on offense with Joe Burrow, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, guys like that. But at the same time, they lost a lot off that defense from last year with 4 guys or whatever it was that went in the first 2 rounds of the draft. And then guess what? Leading up to the season, you lose 2 more players who are probably top 3 or 4 round draft picks next year based on where they're currently viewed by NFL evaluators, and Kerry Vincent, who was a returning starter at Nickelback, and then Tyler Shelvin, who was arguably the best player on their front 7. But at the same time, they have enough talent on that defense, even with all of those guys gone, that it was impossible to foresee some of the issues they've had. So they played 5 games so far. In 3 of those 5 games, Mississippi State, Missouri, and Auburn, those 3 teams have put up their season high for points against LSU. And with Auburn, Auburn ended up with an excess of 500 total yards. It was the latest just bad performance from that Bo Pelini defense. It's been surprising, even with all that they lost, just how bad they've been to this point of the year. And then obviously have a really tough matchup coming up and arguably the top offense in the country in Alabama.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be an ideal moment for that game to happen. Obviously, they are coming off of a bye, but how, John? I mean, I know that you at least have spent some time in the world of Ed Orgeron, and how much good faith, I guess, is he squandering right now? Is this something that they're going to let go in terms of the fan base and the boosters and the people that sort of matter at LSU, or is this going to put him in a tough position going into next season?
Well, I'll tell you how bad have things been for LSU this year. I'm already seeing people comparing him to Gene Chizik, which as nice as Gene has been to AL.com over the last couple of years, is not the comparison you want, especially after winning a national championship. So I think he's got plenty of goodwill at this point. What I think is going to be really interesting is just the amount of pressure he faces throughout the rest of this year and then into the offseason to move on from Bo Pelini. I mean, that to me, even though we're only halfway through the season, I have already seen enough to tell you that was a mistake of a hire. I wrote at the time that I was very skeptical of his abilities after not being a defensive coordinator for more than a decade. I think we've seen a lot of that rust to this point. I mean, that game against Mississippi State looks worse and worse as time goes on, and just his complete inability to make adjustments against Leach's air raid offense. What Bo Nix and Auburn did to them last week was embarrassing. I think he's going to have to make some moves at the end of the season. We've seen him do it once before with Matt Canada, moving on from him and having to pay him a lot of money to take his bags elsewhere. But it seems like he has a closer relationship with Pelini, so I'm curious as to whether he's able to do that. But I think what we've seen so far, and I think this is what I've always kind of believed, is that Ed Orgeron is a terrific recruiter. He's a great motivator. He's not the greatest X's and O's guys. And so it's important for him to be surrounded by the right people. I think Dabo's a guy who gets a kind of similar rep. If you have the right people around him, I think he can win a national championship, which we saw him do last year. If he doesn't have the right people around him, it could be a little more challenging. And I think we've seen that loss of Dave Aranda has been really critical, and they're going to have to do something different going forward if they're going to try to reach the level of success that they had last year.
I'll add into that. So John's completely right that it's always important to be surrounded by good people in terms of your coaching staff. It's also very, very important to have talent on your roster. And this is the exact reason that I think LSU is going to be fine moving forward, even if they struggle the rest of this season. I don't think they're going to fall off the earth by any means in terms of being able to compete for national championships under Ed Orgeron because of the talent that they have on that roster. So if you look both offensively and defensively, you see a lot of young, talented guys that were top recruits. Some of them have done good things through this part of the year, whether it's John Emery, a running back, Miles Brennan at quarterback, Elias Ricks in the defensive backfield, BJ Ojolari, who's ranked somewhere around the top of the SEC in sacks. And then guess what? Just added a 5-star safety the other day. So even if they struggle the rest of this year, I think that you'll see a bounce back from them where they'll get back to being competitive, largely because of the fact that they just have a lot of young, talented guys on that roster.
I agree with you, Matt. I mean, I think that the thing that Orgeron's always going to deliver is strong recruiting. So he's going to be able to do that. It's just about how you then take that talent and what you do with it. We saw Les did a great job recruiting too, and ultimately after a few years of not getting over the hump, people turned on him and the recruiting wasn't enough. So I think Orgeron will always have the talent there. He's always going to buy the right ingredients. It's about whether he has the right sous chefs to kind of turn it into a nice meal. And this year he does not.
That's what's.
I hope you guys like that.
I like your analogy. That's what's kind of interesting to me, though. You both brought up pieces of this, and I think what's weird about it and still confuses me as a viewer of this season is those things are all very interconnected, right? And it's part of why in college football, once you kind of make it, it's very hard to make it to the top because everything has to be working for you at the same time. You have to have good coaches and good talent. And the easiest way to hire promising assistants is to put them in a position where they've got great talent. And the easiest way to recruit great talent is to have good coaches. So it really is a little bit of a catch-22 sometimes, and it's hard to get to that point as a program. But once you're there, you kind of stay there, and you don't see a lot of these top programs, especially the last 10 years or so, kind of like moving in and out of that stratosphere. It's pretty much Bama, Ohio State, Clemson. LSU has been in and around that. I think that they didn't get over the hump till last year, but like there's not a ton of new blue bloods constantly coming in and going. It's pretty stable at the top in college football. And I think that's what really stuns me is there aren't a lot of seasons from those type of programs, from Bama and Clemson and Ohio State, that look like what LSU is doing right now. It's almost hard to explain how you could drop off this bad when you've been recruiting as well as LSU has for as long as they have.
The drop-off, I think, is pretty unprecedented. But I think something that's worth noting, and I think back to a recent story that our colleague Mike Rodak did about Saban, and he talked to Rick Trickett, the longtime offensive line coach for Florida State. And, we saw Florida State win a national championship. They make the playoff the year after, and then there's a drop-off after that point. And he made an interesting point that it's extremely difficult to not kind of rest on your laurels after you win a national championship. And so we can see some of this with LSU. Everybody gets a big raise. Everybody's happy. Everybody made it. Everybody's celebrating. And you kind of have that hangover year the next year. We see it in pro sports a lot. And it's difficult to kind of keep having that energy to move forward. One of the things that makes Nick Saban so incredible is we hear these legendary stories that after he wins his first national championship, he's going around to different underclassmen players and saying, the way we played in that second half is not acceptable. You need to do better next year. That's after a national championship. We didn't see that scene in LSU. And so Saban has been able to find a way to continue grinding to stay at the top of the hill. It's much more difficult for other coaches to do that. I think we're going to see in the next couple of years whether Orgeron can get back up that hill and not kind of just rest off that one national championship.
Yeah, interesting dynamic. He's definitely, he's clearly a guy that enjoys the good times, I would say, more than Saban does, right? He looks like he's probably more fun to play for when things are going well. So I can certainly understand the draw and the attraction to Ed Orgeron and his program. Let's talk about some people that are, I think, less attractive around the SEC right now. I want to talk about a weird issue that I think we're all experiencing this season, in part because a lot more of us are watching more games because we're all at home on Saturdays. So we're seeing a broader scope of the league, I think, overall. But people getting fired up and mad about a lot of stuff this season that we're seeing around the SEC, and directing their anger at specific individuals. And there was a really good example, just to be transparent, there's a really good example this past weekend of a coach literally dressing up as a villain at the post-game press conference with Dan Mullen walking into his post-game media conference wearing a Darth Vader mask. So it brought us to the question of who is the best villain in the SEC this year. And when I mean villain, I'm not making a moral judgment here. I'm not saying any of these guys are bad people, but the guy who crowds at home and in the stadium are most willing to boo, the guy that eats that kind of energy up and likes being the guy that everybody hates. Who do we think is the best example of that this year?
I guess I'll go first here.
Yeah, you go first, John.
I'm going with kind of a force behind the scenes that I think has driven a lot of this attention and anger. I'm going SEC officiating. SEC, you can call it the replay booth, whatever you want to call it. It's been at the heart of a lot of the kind of crazy things we've seen this year. If the SEC doesn't make the mistake that it did in that Ole Miss Auburn game, then we don't see Lane Kiffin retweeting some pretty disparaging comments and getting a $25,000 fine. I think if the SEC officiating makes the right call on a Kyle Trask late hit, we probably don't see Dan Mullen lose his mind and kind of incite a brawl and then wear the Darth Vader costume afterwards. So there's been it's the force behind the scenes that's making all these things happen. And I think it's the one group that brings every SEC fan together in hatred. That's SEC officiating.
Hard to argue against the Zebras as a potential villain. A long time staple villain in all sports.
They've
Matt,
got staying power.
That's right. Yeah.
It has not been a good year for officiating in the SEC. I don't think anybody would argue with that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff is because we're catching them more because there's more of us at home watching. I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm off.
I think two calls specifically would have gotten a lot of attention regardless, especially considering the role that those blown calls played in the outcome of games.
Yeah,
I would say, to your point, Scalici, a decade ago, particularly that Auburn Ole Miss game, we wouldn't even had the technology, the camera angle to see it graze his pinky. We might have thought it was close, but I don't think we would have been able to see it to the level that we did. So that's part of the benefit of technology improving, is that we have all these different angles that we can really, really kind of lock in and really kind of, I think, accentuates how bad some of these calls have been.
I think a no whistle on something is different than this thing that, like you said, John, none of us would have even seen unless we were watching a broadcast team specifically point it out to us. Right. I don't think any of us would have seen the pinky touch live. I think we saw it all because the folks running the broadcast of the game decided to focus on that. But Matt, let's get your nomination for best villain in the SEC.
Well, Darth Vader would be an easy one to throw out, but I'll go a different direction and go with the king of social media, Lane Kiffin. So Lane, probably more so than any coach I've ever seen, is just very transparent and open in terms of his feelings and thoughts and how he shares things on social media and specifically Twitter, and is just a fun person to see how he goes about things from that perspective. But the cool thing with Lane also, even aside from just some of the things that are enjoyable, I'm sure, for reporters and fans to follow on there that maybe aren't as enjoyable for the league office in the SEC. The cool thing for him to go along with that is he's actually putting together an entertaining, respectable product on the field where Ole Miss is ranked among the better offenses in the conference and is a team right now that, if not for the blown call that we've already talked about some in the Auburn game, could easily be 3-3 right now heading into the back part of the schedule, where face 3 teams out of their final 4 games that are currently unranked. So they're 2-4 at this point, but at the same time have a chance to finish out the year on a strong note based on how they're playing right now, and combining that with the fact that they have some very winnable games coming up, including a game against Mississippi State.
Yeah, and I do think also part of Lane's, let's say, his free-spiritedness this season, I think some of that comes from the fact that he's stepping into a situation where there aren't super high expectations. Not to knock the tradition of Ole Miss football, but like you're walking into a situation where if you give them anything to be excited about, they're pretty happy about it. You can afford to. Are they mad that they had that blown opportunity against Auburn? I'm sure they are. But to me, when I look out there on social media, I don't think Ole Miss fans feel bad about the way the season's going, and I don't think they feel bad even about losing to Alabama. I mean, they got to go toe-to-toe with Alabama for 4 quarters, and I think you have to consider that a positive for the program, considering what they're coming off of right now. So Lane has this, like, I think we know enough about him to know that he speaks his mind regardless, but you can do that with a little bit more confidence and swagger when you know that you're already kind of exceeding their expectations anyway.
Yeah. The biggest thing you want with a first-year coach, 2 things: progress, and even more so than that, reason for optimism. And I think Lane and that coaching staff have definitely given them that. Like I said, it could easily be 3-3 right now if not for that blown call against Auburn, and have that final stretch of the season where out of those 4 games face 3 unranked teams. So definitely in position to finish the year on a strong note.
Lane's the perfect coach for Ole Miss. I mean, not only does he look like every 40-something former frat boy that you'll see in the Grove on a Saturday. But Ole Miss fans love swagger. They're so used to being kind of at the bottom that a guy who's coming in and willing to shake things up, willing to, throw some punches, throw some jabs, they love it. And I'll just say, I love that pick, Zenitz. One of my favorite things about Kiffin is just he's such like a joker that it's hard to even know when he's being serious and when he's not. And he's good at selling you on it. Like, I'm not convinced, despite what he said, that he didn't mess up the math on the pennies thing. But he sells you on the fact that he did that on purpose to get more attention. And you're kind of like, I don't know, maybe he did. And like, he just has this whole kind of like mystery around him that I think is perfect for the SEC.
But he also, I think honestly, my favorite thing about him is that even after stuff like getting fined, right? Like, he got fined $25,000. Okay, that's a big hit. I don't care how much money you make.
Yeah.
You don't want to.
Not for somebody with Lane's bank account.
I don't know, man. I don't.
A few years ago, where he was talking about how he was basically like losing money between child support and spousal support. Lane might need that money more than you think.
Maybe, yeah. Look, I think regardless, $25K is a hit. You're gonna feel it. Unless they gave you all your salary at once, which I don't think they did, it's going to take a chunk out. I think the fact that happens to him, right, and he comes out laughing about it and joking about it, and not just joking in an aggressive, mean-spirited way. Like, he's laughing at himself for putting himself in that situation. And I think it's so rare to find a college football coach who can laugh at himself. It's probably the single most rare personality trait in that business. These are guys who
into to this level before, but the important thing to keep in mind with Lane also, I think people both in the coaching world, the football world, and then even just casual fan realize the kind of offensive mind he is and his track record in terms of what he's done offensively, but he's continued to prove this year just how great of an offensive mind he is, and continue to prove also that he's a pretty good head coach to go along with it.
I think you're right. I think it all really he's got a lot working in his favor in terms of going forward, and he's still a relatively young guy in this business. So pretty good chance that Ole Miss is not his last career stop at this point. So enjoy him while you can, Rebels. We'll see. Maybe not. Maybe he sets up shop there. I'm gonna go for mine. Mine's sort of similar to John's in that it is officiating related, but I'm gonna go with the disembodied phenomenon that the internet collectively refers to as Auburn Jesus, and that is. You can call it luck. You can call it a sequence of calls going Auburn's way. And they're not. I think this gets misinterpreted sometimes as people saying that the SEC is biased in favor of Auburn. I don't think that's what this is at all, and I don't think that's how it's meant to be referred to by people who talk about Auburn Jesus. I think we're talking about things like the referee just swallowing his whistle when Bo Nix spikes the ball backwards and it should have been a fumble. Like, that's just dumb luck, right? That is, and that's a part of the sport. You sometimes mistakes have to be made that favor you for you to win a close game. And it's just been really funny to see how many of those have happened in Auburn's favor this year. They obviously didn't need it against LSU, but I mean, we've talked about already against Arkansas, against Kentucky, against Ole Miss. They had calls that went their way that kind of felt like they changed at least the momentum of the game. In the Arkansas case, it may have literally been the difference between winning and losing.
I forgot about the Kentucky one so long ago, and the other ones were obviously I completely forgot about the Kentucky one.
There was a questionable call in the end zone, and now I'm forgetting what it was.
At the end of the first half, where it looked like Kentucky had gotten into the end zone and they were rolled short of the end zone.
That's
then
right.
They had the interception, so instead of Kentucky scoring,
yes,
Auburn got the interception.
Yeah, and I think that it's become a thing that when I look at, again, a lot of my experience of this is on Twitter, but I think Auburn fans embrace this phenomenon on Twitter. I think they know that everybody expects this kind of stuff to happen for them now, and this is the true nature of being a heel villain, right? Like in the wrestling sense, is when there's something people hate about you, you lean into it and have fun with it. And I think that this is an aspect of Auburn fandom that I think the Auburn fan base generally has a lot of fun with. They know that people expect crazy coincidental luck to happen in their favor, and when it does, they live it up, they embrace it, and it makes other fan bases so mad because they see Auburn on the ropes multiple times this season, and Auburn finds a way to squirm out of it, sometimes through no effort of their own. Sometimes things just fall their way. So to me, that's been a big part of the narrative of this season that I've enjoyed.
It's been a banner year for Auburn Jesus, which if you're an Alabama fan has to make you a little nervous. It's shaping up to be quite a year. We saw, the most famous one, obviously the prayer and Jordan Hare, then getting the kick six after that. They've already won 2 games because of kind of weird shenanigans. I'd be worried. Who knows what's going to happen there.
And they're not out of the race for the SEC West yet either. Until Alabama is to a point where they can't get 2 losses, one of which being to Auburn, Auburn's still in the mix for the SEC West race.
Because that was a team that going into last week, if not for 2 blown calls specifically, easily could have been 1-4 going into that game. Instead, 4-2, and once again, like we talked about earlier, have a good chance to be 6-2 by the time they face Alabama.
Anything can happen, but I will say right now, I will be absolutely shocked if Alabama has 2 losses.
It would be tough for Alabama to lose any of those other games.
I don't gamble, but I would put a lot on the fact they will not have 2 losses.
Yeah,
you're a team in the SEC right now that I would be confident betting on to beat Alabama, and probably even confident to keep it within 10 to 14 points with Alabama at this.
You wouldn't put Auburn in that category?
I'd be interested to see how it would go right now. Obviously, we saw Georgia against Alabama. We saw Texas A&M against Alabama. The only team out of the 4 that are probably the best in the conference at this point that we haven't seen match up against them is Florida. Right. And we'll get a very good feel on Florida this weekend when they go up against Georgia. But that's really the only team at this point that, based on what they have on that roster and how they've played thus far, with the exception of maybe the Texas A&M game, looks like they would.
All right, Matt froze up on us. I think he was wrapping his point up. Oh, there he is. Okay, we got you back, Matt. Yeah. There's definitely less certainty out there, I think, throughout the rest of the league, but it does seem to be pretty stable at the top right now with Alabama and Georgia. Again, like Matt said, we'll see what happens this weekend with Florida and Georgia. I think that's one of the most interesting games left on the schedule for the entire season. So it will be cool to see how that one plays out. And we will continue covering this wild season as we go along here on First Down South. John Talty and Matt Zenitz, thanks, guys, for both of you joining me today. And I hope everybody has a good rest of the day. And try to give yourself some fun stuff to distract yourself with as we all make it through this crazy day.